In the spring of 1942, a Japanese naval officer named Tanaka Ichiro, stationed at a coastal defense post outside Tokyo, wrote a report to his superiors that would later be studied by Imperial General Headquarters as an uncomfortable case study in the limits of Japan's home island defenses. He wrote, "We were told the home islands were beyond the reach of American bombers. We were told our defensive perimeter made this attack a mathematical impossibility. 16 aircraft flew directly over this position at low altitude in broad daylight, and not one of our defenses engaged them before they had already released their bombs and continued on their way." He was not describing a failed intercept of a large formation. He was describing the immediate aftermath of what Japanese command would come to know as the Doolittle Raid, a strike that Japanese strategic planning had considered so implausible that no coordinated home island air defense had been organized to specifically counter it. This is not a story assembled from American accounts of heroism or the celebrated legacy of the raid's planners. This is a story built from Japanese naval reports, intelligence assessments, and the private notebooks of officers who had every professional reason to describe Japan's home defenses as adequate, and who instead, again and again, reached for language that described not a battle lost, but a fundamental assumption about the war's geography proven false in a single afternoon. To understand why the Doolittle Raid mattered so profoundly to Japanese strategic thinking, you need to understand the assumption it destroyed. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese naval planners had constructed their entire Pacific strategy around a specific geographic calculation. American land-based bombers lacked the range to strike Japan's home islands from any available Allied airbase, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's own carrier forces, considered the most capable in the Pacific at that stage of the war, formed an effective picket line against any carrier-based strike large enough to threaten the home islands directly. This assumption was not merely convenient. It was the load-bearing premise of Japan's entire early war strategic posture, allowing Imperial General Headquarters to commit the bulk of its naval and air power to offensive operations across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific without diverting significant resources to home island air defense. Admiral Ugaki Matome, Chief of Staff to the Combined Fleet, wrote in his private diary in the weeks before the raid, an entry recovered and translated after the war, "The home islands remain secure from direct attack by virtue of distance alone. No American carrier could approach close enough to launch a strike without first being detected and destroyed by our picket line, and no land-based bomber possesses the range to reach us from any base currently available to the enemy." This is not optimism. This is geography. This was not an unreasonable assessment. It reflected sound naval doctrine applied to what appeared to be an insurmountable physical constraint. Raid itself depended on a solution to that geographic constraint that Japanese naval planning had not considered plausible, launching Army Air Force's medium bombers, aircraft never designed for carrier operations, and normally requiring far more runway than any carrier deck provided. From the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, at a distance far greater than any carrier strike force would normally approach a defended coastline. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, commanding the mission, had spent months training crews to take off, in a fraction of the normal distance required for the B-25 Mitchell bombers involved, a technical achievement that Japanese naval aviation officers, upon later learning the details, considered barely credible. Captain Watanabe Yasuji, a staff officer attached to the Combined Fleet who reviewed the raid's technical details after the war as part of a historical assessment, wrote, "Even understanding after the fact precisely how this was accomplished, evaluating the training required, the modifications to the aircraft, and the piloting skill necessary to launch a twin-engine Army bomber from a carrier deck in the distance available, I find myself questioning whether I would have believed this possible had I been briefed on the plan in advance, rather than assessing it as a completed fact." However, the tactical reality facing Japan's home defenses on April 18, 1942, was considerably more disruptive than a single unexpected technical achievement. The American carrier task force built around the Hornet was in fact detected by a Japanese picket vessel roughly 700 nautical miles from Tokyo, farther from the coast than American planners had intended for the launch, forcing Doolittle's crews to take off hours earlier than planned and from a greater distance than the mission had been designed around. By any conventional military calculation, this early detection should have given Japanese home defense forces ample warning to organize an effective intercept. Rear Admiral Kondo Shinji, responsible for coordinating home island air defense reports in the raid's aftermath, wrote in an assessment that was later studied by Imperial General Headquarters, "The picket vessel that detected the American task force transmitted a warning. They reached command centers with several hours to spare before the aircraft arrived over Tokyo. This warning was not disregarded through negligence. It was disregarded because no doctrine existed for interpreting a warning of this specific kind, land-based bombers approaching from a carrier at extreme range, as a credible threat requiring immediate large-scale interception. Yet one variable remained systematically unaccounted for in the Japanese assessments compiled both before and immediately after the raid. appearing with striking consistency across reports filed by officers who had no incentive to inflate the caliber of an American operation their own doctrine considered geographically implausible. That variable concerned the specific willingness of American military planners to accept an extraordinarily high probability of aircraft loss, since the bombers involved could not return to the carrier after launch and were instead intended to continue on to airfields in China, a plan that depended on favorable weather, functioning radio communication, and Chinese cooperation that could not be fully guaranteed given the early, unplanned launch distance. Japanese naval doctrine assumed that a rational military planning process would weight the near certainty of losing the entire strike force against the actual military value of the bombs delivered. A calculation that, under any conventional cost-benefit framework available to combined fleet staff, should have argued strongly against attempting the mission at all, given the modest physical damage 16 medium bombers could realistically inflict on a target as large as Tokyo. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of history we cover here. Accounts recovered not from the victors' commemorations, but from the defenders' own internal reports, the version filed for their own high command, and never intended for anyone outside their chain of command to read. If that kind of documented, unfiltered history is what brings you here, subscribing costs nothing and tells us to keep pulling these archives into the light. Admiral Ugaki's diary, continuing in entries written in the days immediately following the raid, addressed this specific calculation directly, and the tone shifts markedly from the confident geographic assessment written weeks earlier. He wrote, "The material damage inflicted by this raid is genuinely minor, and by any conventional measure of military value, an operation risking 16 aircraft and their crews for this result would not appear to justify its own cost. And yet the psychological effect on planning at every level of our command structure has been immediate and substantial. We committed our strategic posture to an assumption that the enemy would not accept this specific risk calculation, precisely because no rational military planner should accept it. The enemy accepted it anyway, and our geography no longer protects us in the manner we believed it did." Read that sentence again. The Chief of Staff to Japan's combined fleet is admitting, in his own private diary, that Japan's entire early war strategic posture had depended on an assumption about what an opposing military would consider an acceptable risk, and that the raid's actual military damage was almost irrelevant compared to the strategic assumption its mere execution had disproven. It never behaved like doctrine predicted. Not once. The doctrine had assumed the enemy would calculate the way Japanese planners themselves would calculate. The doctrine had been wrong about that from the beginning. Among the individual accounts populating the Japanese record of the raid's aftermath, one detail recurs with particular frequency, concerning the immediate reorganization of Imperial General Headquarters' strategic priorities in the weeks that followed. Japanese Naval Command, which had been debating whether to prioritize a further eastward advance against American positions or consolidate existing gains in Southeast Asia, resolved this internal debate with unusual speed following the raid, committing significant naval resources to an operation intended to eliminate the American carrier threat decisively at Midway Atoll less than 2 months later. Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, reviewing the strategic decision-making process for a post-war historical assessment conducted with the cooperation of American military historians, wrote, "The raid itself inflicted negligible material damage. Its strategic effect, however, was to resolve a planning debate that had been ongoing for months in a matter of days, in favor of the more aggressive option, specifically because senior naval leadership could no longer accept the political and psychological cost of appearing unable to defend the home islands from further attack. This urgency, more than any careful strategic calculation, shaped the decisions that led directly to the engagement at Midway. However, the tactical picture that emerged from Japanese intelligence, assessments compiled in the months following the raid, revealed a further dimension to this pattern that officers found difficult to categorize, using standard frameworks for evaluating an opponent's strategic behavior. An intelligence officer identified and captured post-war interview records only by the surname Fuchida wrote, "We had assessed American strategic planning as fundamentally conservative in the early months of this war, an assessment based on the material weakness of American Pacific forces following the losses at Pearl Harbor. The raid demonstrated a willingness to accept operational risk disproportionate to available resources when a strategic or psychological objective justified it. This reassessment arrived too late to influence our planning before Midway, and I have come to believe this delay in reassessment cost us more than any single tactical error made during that later engagement." What the Japanese record ultimately preserves, across naval reports, intelligence memoranda, and the post-war reflections of officers who had staked their entire strategic framework on an assumption about American military behavior, is not primarily a story of overwhelming material damage inflicted on Japan's home islands. 16 medium bombers, carrying a modest bomb load each, could not and did not inflict damage remotely comparable to the raids that would come later in the war. There is a further detail in the Japanese record worth examining separately, because it appears not in a single officer's account, but across several reports filed by men with no direct connection to one another during the raid itself or its immediate aftermath. Multiple Japanese accounts describe a specific and lasting change in Home Island civil defense posture that outlasted the war's early years by a considerable margin, one that several officers explicitly attributed to the raid, rather than to any subsequent, more materially destructive attack. Rear Admiral Kondo's report, continuing beyond his initial assessment of the failed intercept, addressed this shift directly. He wrote, "Resources committed to Home Island air defense in the months following this raid exceeded what any purely military calculation of the actual threat would justify. Fighter squadrons, anti-aircraft batteries, and observation networks were diverted from offensive theaters to home defense in a manner that our own internal assessments at the time acknowledged was driven substantially by the political impossibility of allowing a second undetected raid, rather than by a considered judgment of the raid's demonstrated capability to inflict serious military harm. This detail matters because it reveals the raid's actual mechanism of damage more precisely than any accounting of bombs dropped or buildings destroyed." Vice Admiral Ozawa's post-war assessment addressed this same dynamic from a different angle. He wrote, "A strategic effect achieved through psychological and political pressure on a command structure can, in certain circumstances, exceed the effect achievable through comparable material destruction, because the response it provokes is disproportionate to the threat and difficult to reverse once institutional momentum has been established in that direction. This is, I believe, the accurate accounting of what this raid achieved. And it is a lesson our own planning process absorbed too slowly to prevent the strategic errors that followed at Midway 2 months later. It is a more specific story about a particular military planning culture's willingness to accept extraordinary operational risk in pursuit of an objective that could not be measured in destroyed factories or military casualties, and about the strategic disruption that willingness caused when it collided with an opposing command structure that had built its entire early war posture around the assumption that no rational military planner would accept that risk. Japanese naval officers, writing in the careful and unsentimental language of professional strategists describing the collapse of a core planning assumption, repeatedly identified this quality, not the bombs themselves, as the actual mechanism of the raid's lasting effect. Most of the American crews who flew the mission survived, scattering across China after running out of fuel, aided in their escape by Chinese villagers and resistance networks who took considerable personal risk in sheltering them from Japanese search parties, a fact that would later contribute to brutal Japanese reprisals against Chinese civilian populations in the regions believed to have assisted the airmen. Reprisals that Japanese military planners themselves would later cite as a further indication of how disproportionately the raid's psychological weight had come to outstrip its modest physical footprint. The men who flew from the deck of the Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942, did not do so because the mission was survivable by any conventional calculation. They did so because Japan's entire strategic geography had been built on the assumption that no one would try, and the trying itself turned out to matter more than anything the bombs actually destroyed.